First off, can I just say thank you? My daughter is a teacher, and I guess I've always appreciated teachers. I've always appreciated everybody in a school, but as a dad who understands at the end of the day what it's like to talk to your daughter after she's put everything she possibly has into helping those kids, after she feels wrung dry, after she sometimes wonders what pastes her back together again, and then she has the joy of that moment when something breaks through. I can't possibly know what it's like for you in your work every day, but as a dad, I just want to say thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause for the amazing work that you do. It's really awesome. Now, you're around kids most of the day. I am not. And so one of the things that I love more than almost anything is to go to a playground, because when I walk up to a playground, there's something that happens when I start to hear those voices. And you probably hear them in a different way, because after a while, maybe they get on your nerves. Well, let's get honest, okay, every once in a while. But I'm telling you, for me, it's a wonderful moment. I want to tell you two stories about walking up to a playground, exact same circumstance, that tells exactly why we are deeply in trouble and why we are on the brink of greatness. Same story. It starts by you walking up to a playground and hearing those voices. And I want you in your mind's eye to visualize one of those and hear these kids as you come up to this playground, probably some young kids especially, and you hear those voices and they sound so hopeful in so many ways. And as you get a little closer, you notice something. And you're a little embarrassed that you notice it, but you notice it because you know something matters. You know as you come up that one of the kids on that playground has skin about the color of mine. And you notice that the other kid has skin that's a little darker. You're a little embarrassed to notice that, but you know something. You know something in the United States of America today, with all of our greatness, with all the wonderful things we do, you know that still today you can predict the likelihood of a child's success by looking at the color of their skin. We can still predict the likelihood of a child's success in the United States of America by looking at the color of their skin. And then you know something else. You know that there is nowhere in the country where that is more true than in the blessed community of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And that's what weighs heavily on my shoulders, and that's what made me, after 12 years as mayor and doing really powerful things, I felt, I had a pretty heavy weight when I said I came in as the mayor of the city with the largest achievement gap in the country, and I left as the city with the largest achievement gap in the country. That's on my shoulders, that's on your shoulders, and I don't need to give anybody in this room a lecture about it. You work on this issue every single day. That's the tough part. And I want to tell you that exact same story with something different. I want you to walk up, I want you to hear the voices, I want you to see exactly the same thing. Recognize the skin color, understand that same thing, but recognize something else is going on. Those two kids are playing together. That's a very simple thing, but it's part of a much larger thing that's going on in this community. This community is dramatically more diverse than it used to be. This is a humanitarian center that's opened its arms to people who've crossed waters for war. The huge things have happened. And not only do those kids bring with us tremendous cultural fluency and language skills, but also the African-American kid in North Minneapolis, the American Indian kid from South Minneapolis, who take a bus to school, who go downtown to their summer job, and cross cultural barriers every day, possess something that is now the most valuable thing that you need in the new economy. The ability to cross a boundary is exactly the most important commodity that is needed in every one of those high-rises over there. Target. Think about who they're selling to. They can't just sell to people who have experience as majority culture kids and majority culture schools. They need people who can cross barriers. So that African-American kid on that playground knows something that that white kid who's been in a majority community all their life doesn't. The point is, if we can get this right, with the most diverse diversity that most any community has, we can be a global powerhouse. We can solve war and peace issues. We can do huge issues because we all need each other. And if anybody says that kids of color in this community have an achievement gap, that is true. There is also an opportunity gap, but it is also true that the students from majority schools who are part of a majority culture have a gap as well. And they need to cross a barrier to understand people who are different than them, and that capacity is possessed far more by people who know what it's like to be in a room where you're not part of the majority. And when 3M or Cargill or any of our companies want to send someone to somewhere like China who's not going to get flipped out by the fact that they're not like everybody in that room, that kid who's used to doing that can teach the other kid the same. The point is, we are on the brink of a great choice in this community, and you're on the front lines of that. So what are we really going to do about that? Well, the fact of the matter is, there is a lot of compassion in this community, and we have done phenomenal things. Phenomenal things. We've solved huge issues. I've seen the capacity of this community. I've seen what we do when a bridge collapses or a tornado goes through town. We do huge things. But what's the challenge here? Because there's a tremendous amount of work going on, and we are still facing these gaps. I propose that what we have is a log jam of compassion. And here's what I mean by that. Think about a river. Think about a log jam. The logs are coming down. They've got lots of energy coming down with the current. They're coming down the Mississippi, and pretty soon they start to clog up. The energy is working against each other. Now, I have never unclogged a log jam. I have read about it in books, okay? And what I know about log jams is that you don't just shove it from behind with a bunch of power. What you do is you look for what's called a key log. What's that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 logs that can be moved that suddenly have everything aligned? Now, why am I talking about log jams when we're talking about kids? I'm saying it because imagine all of those logs are the thousands of phenomenal initiatives and schools and efforts that we have in this community. And shame on us as adults for not being better at moving those key logs and moving ourselves in the same direction. We have the capacity to solve this problem. We have the capacity to raise a generation where every kid thrives, but we do not yet have the alignment. So that's what I do for a living. And I'm not the only person who can do that. I'm part of a group of people who are trying to take all of this energy and try to figure out what's the best path forward. How do we move together? So this morning, 500 people, part of our whole group, were in the other room, just down the hall, with our annual meeting. We brought out a whole report that went through the different steps that we're taking. And kind of the humor of this thing is when this group started, I was the mayor. And after about a year with these foundations and school leaders and community leaders and all that, I was mad. I was mad we weren't moving fast enough. And I was saying we've got to move faster and harder. And so when I announced I wasn't running again, they said, oh, you think this is so easy, clown? Why don't you take over? So that's the challenge they gave me, but that's what we're doing. So this morning, what we did is we walked through our battle plan a little bit. And I'll just ask you to go to gennextmsp.org, our website, where we can go into detail about all of the issues and the tactics that we're taking. But basically what we do is we lay out the data, we try to align. And so, for instance, this morning we talked about our first goal of getting every kid ready for kindergarten. The key log, after a lot of work with a lot of people out in the community, was to decide the most important thing that wasn't happening is we weren't doing a good enough job of identifying issues with kids earlier before they got into school. What we're finding in 3rd grade, we should be finding at 3 years old. That's why we've launched an effort to screen every 3-year-old, not just with a doctor, but a full health and developmental screening. We brought people together across boundaries, medical, counties, all that, and we've increased screening 16%. And because we're making so much progress, this morning we got a new grant for $1 million to focus just on screening 3-year-olds and improve that system. We're going to do a better job of making sure the kids that come into your school are checked for their eyesight and hearing, have interventions to make sure that their social and emotional well-being is better. We heard a great story about a mom who had twins and was worried one of them wasn't developing very well. She couldn't communicate. Well, she had a speech issue. They got her therapy. She started kindergarten at grade level, and her life was changed because of that. One life, because we screened her early. There are 10,000 3-year-olds in Minneapolis, St. Paul, 7,000 unscreened. We've increased that 16%, and we're going to keep going. So that's one of the things we're doing. The second thing we're doing is getting into the part of the child care system where the quality level is most erratic, but also where the cultural fluency is most important. In licensed family home care, the part that my wife and I chose, to go to a house in our neighborhood with someone who was in our community, that's a great system. That was a great opportunity for my wife and I, but we also realized the quality of that is very varied across. And it's very difficult to bring some of the great efforts we've had in quality rating into those. So what we did this morning was we laid out a plan. We got major funding to do that, and over the next 3 years, we're going to move the quality level of licensed family home care from 8 to 35%, okay? We're going to be really specific and held accountable for that. So again, the children coming into your schools will have a better start. And in literacy, what we've done with all of those out-of-school partners who work on reading strategies, we've had them at a table for a year. They're all comparing what works. How are we losing kids of color? How are we gaining kids of color? What are we doing? We're learning that together. We're improving their practice. We're going out and recruiting more tutors, especially tutors of color, to move forward on that. And we're going to continue to do that work so that the efforts on the outside of school do a better job of helping you there. In high school graduation, we're working with the 2 districts and building in systems that give you early warning for credit loss much earlier than your senior year when you're not graduating, but way back in the 9th grade and even 8th grade. So we're laying out many of these different strategies, and I won't give you the whole thing. You can see that. But the bottom line is, for the first time in this community, the major foundations, the school districts, the out-of-school time, all of that, we're all trying to move in a single direction. But what we also did is say it's not enough to just take the first 5 goals that we had. Ready for kindergarten, reading at 3rd grade, math by 8th grade, high school graduation, post-secondary. We realized there are also those character skills that so many of your schools were formed on. So many of your schools reach out in a way that I think is important to say that if we really have kids who may not fit in one box, but somehow we can break through to their character, we can do great things. The social and emotional learning component of all this is important. So we wanted to make a major body of work on that. And a fascinating thing happened. Over this past year, we've done a lot of research. We had access to a lot at the University of Minnesota and really tried to delve into what do we know about these character skills beyond just what's on the test. And the first thing that comes out of that research is a very clear sense that while we have extremely large achievement gaps in the math and the sciences, those gaps shrink dramatically when we get into some of the social and emotional issues like commitment to learning, positive identity, academic perseverance. What are we learning on this? What we're learning on this is it's giving us a whole new window into race and culture. It's unpacking that really helpful but ridiculous term, communities of color, as if there is one view. I'll give you an example. The research that we've done, and we took, in this case, this was data out of St. Paul schools. We looked at data on that, and it said, the first thing it said was, in all of these indicators, everything takes a huge nosedive in 8th grade. Now, any parent could tell you 8th grade is complicated. Anybody teach 8th grade? Anybody in an 8th grade classroom? It's complicated, right? One of the things about it, though, is that if you really unpack all of the social and emotional data on all of that, it shows something really complicated happens. Commitment to learning, for instance, goes down. It comes back up again. So it's tough when a kid is not as committed to their task, but it gets back. But positive identity takes a nosedive and often never comes back. So we really use that research to say we're going to focus especially on those skills leading up into 8th grade. But then we looked at this and disaggregated all the data. And it was fascinating because sadly I'm used to looking at all these graphs that have white kids over here and various communities of color below that. That's not what it's like when you look at commitment to learning. When you take that measure, something very interesting happens. White kids are about in the middle on that. And what you have then is below the level on commitment to learning are Latino kids, Native kids, and mixed race kids. Above the level of where white students are, African Americans, Asians, Hmong, and way above are Somalis. So ask yourself this, when was the last time you heard 2 white parents confide to each other, you know, I want my kid in a classroom with kids who are committed to learning. I better get him in a classroom with African Americans, Hmong, Asians, and Somalis. That's what actually the data says. Now, we shouldn't take data as fact, even though they're facts. What we should do is have it be a window to begin to ask ourselves questions. And the beautiful thing is, we are unpacking this issue about the assets people bring to the table. And that's where we turn this whole thing of the achievement gap on its head. The fact of the matter is, those 2 kids playing on a playground are represented by something much deeper, and we need to have an understanding of that. Now, you as people in classrooms and in schools understand this, and we know a lot about what it takes place in learning. And I'm not the key educator in this room. You're doing this work. Let me play back to you what we know collectively about this. 2 students, let's say they're 8th graders, are sitting in front of you. You've given them, let's say, a book report that they had to do a little bit of planning on. And near the end of the semester, they come in and show their work. And one student did a tremendous job. They really planned this. They began working early in advance. They mapped it out. They were very organized. They did a great job, and you give them an A. The other student clearly didn't figure out how to manage their time very well. And as they went through all of this, they didn't do a very good job in the report. They didn't think ahead. They didn't do much deep analysis on that, and you gave them a C-. And then you started to think a little bit. While that is true of where they came from, let's also understand a little bit about what's behind them. What is the character issue? What do we know about development? What do we know about executive function? That ability to look forward, to do that long-range planning. And we know that that's a much easier function to develop in a child when there are very few threats around. But if the child is highly mobile, if the child has great violence or challenge in their home life, if the child is stressed in nutrition or anything else, their development of executive function is less. Now let's talk real English here. You're walking through the woods, you're looking around, you have a great time, you're thinking big thoughts, what am I doing with my life, all these things. All of a sudden a bear comes, right? So when the bear comes, you're not thinking the big thoughts. You're not looking forward. What you're really doing is you're dealing with survival in the moment. If that bear is always there, if that child is facing that threat, if that child is facing great trauma, that executive function, that ability to look forward, that ability to think those big thoughts does not develop the same. So what we have to do is to delve down and recognize those issues. But as we do that, we also have to go beyond just the numbers that I look at much of the day and begin to ask deeper questions. One of those deeper questions we have to ask is, why is it in this amazingly gifted community with this achievement gap, is it also a place where there's a gap in safety, in income, and multiple other things that cross right along racial lines? This community has to engage in a tough, honest conversation about race and racism and the systemic issues behind these things, because while we can do everything we can in school, we have to do even more in community and about ourselves. And that is not an easy thing for anyone to say, but it's something that, frankly, a whole lot of white people have to say a whole lot more, because white is a color, and this is not an issue about a benign white community reaching back to help other people come up to quote unquote where we are. That is an old model that never was true and is never going to work. We're going to have to be raw honest with each other. And we're going to have to talk about race, and we're going to have to talk about systems, and we're going to have to talk about exactly what has been wrong, but more important, what can be right. If we look into the eye of every child, if we see an asset, and we maximize that asset. And I want to finish that point with a funny thing that I heard that was probably the smartest thing I heard all year. I was in a room with a group of researchers who were much smarter than me, and we were talking about what we're going to do in math, because it's really vexing for us. And we went through about an hour and a half of discussion, and finally one of them said, you know, my daughter taught, let me remember how this all went. My daughter taught math class in Los Angeles, and she had a really difficult time explaining negative numbers. You know, think about that. You know, here's 0. Now we've taught you 0. Now we're going to say less than 0. It's just a really bizarre concept, right? So she moved from Los Angeles and came to Minnesota and couldn't figure it out. She started teaching this class, and all these kids suddenly understood negative numbers. Why would Minnesota kids understand negative numbers? January, below 0, right? Isn't that interesting? So it's funny, but it's also really incredibly important. Apply that to all of our work. Here we have a unique population in a unique place, has a unique knowledge, and if we work with them, we can understand that. Those Minnesota kids can teach those LA kids all about negative numbers, okay? Apply that to all of our work. We are each assets, and I'm not just singing kumbaya up here. That's not a nice thing to hope for. That is the raw reality, and this community will not move forward. And I, as somebody who loves this community as anybody could possibly love it, knows we cannot move forward unless we solve this issue, not by just being nice and helping other people, but recognizing every part of this community has to engage in a tough, honest, inspirational conversation about a new future that's about all of us together, that starts at the exact place that you go every day. You are at ground zero. So I want to thank you for your work. And I want to tell you one more thing. I said I was going to finish, but I do because so many of you work with students who didn't connect perfectly in the core system. One of the things we've thought about with all of this data we have is that it matters what you count. Does anybody follow baseball? Okay, in baseball, and this relates to your work, I'm not doing a digression here, but in baseball, the starting pitcher got all the glory. The people who came in the later innings never got any glory until somebody smart came up with something called the save. It was a stat that we used to really put a value on how good a relief pitcher did. Well, isn't that interesting? Because you know what? The core statistics we look at, graduation, if we graduate on time, if we hit the math standards by 8th grade or the reading by 3rd grade. But what about the people, like many in this room, who deal with a kid in 4th grade and 5th grade and 6th grade who's not reading, or in 9th grade or 10th grade or 11th who hasn't mastered math, or the ones who go to a school where the kid hadn't graduated and a couple years after they get them through school? You know what? You're the relief pitchers, and we ought to develop a way of measuring that, the save for what you're doing. So I want to, and we're not there yet, but that's what we're going to try to do. So I want to finish with that, and I want to also finish with where I started. I will go home tonight, probably have a conversation with my daughter. She'll talk a little bit about her day. We'll have a great conversation about that, and as a dad, I'll put my head on the pillow and say, I'm so glad that my daughter goes out and teaches every day, but I have never been more proud of my daughter, and I have never been more proud to be in a community where I look out on a whole room of people who are on the front lines of the most important battle we will ever face. And you know what? We're going to win. Thanks so much. It's great to see you.